One of the most startling things that we get from Emily Dickinson is a true sight inside the mind of the writer. Now, Emily Dickinson called publication the auction of the mind of man. And it's true, perhaps there was a little bit of sour grapes towards the world of publishing as she was such an outsider, and that's understandable. How often do you hear people complain about gatekeepers today? I'm one of them. I think that there's a lot of mishmash, mealy mouth stuff going on in the world of publication. But Emily Dickinson, that said, did not expect for her poetry to be found in this way, or published in this way. What we have here is something more akin to finding the diary of a genius, something more akin to finding the true thoughts of an individual that have not been filtered towards unfamiliar audience. Now, a lot of her poems were shared with people that she cared about and that she felt cared about her. And that's a different type of thing for many people than submitting these things for wide appeal. She had probably no reason to believe that 100 and some odd years after her death, some dummy like me would be reading her poetry, her deepest thoughts, and talking about them on YouTube for other people to hear some dummy's thoughts about them and how wrong I get these things. But because of that, because probably Emily Dickinson never really expected her poetry to get out here in this way, we have something raw and unfiltered. Unfiltered past the point of putting them on paper. And so we get a poem like this. We get a poem that's You Cannot Put a Fire Out, which reads as such. You cannot put a fire out. A thing that can ignite can go itself without a fan upon the slowest night. You cannot fold a flood and put it in a drawer because the winds would find it out and tell your cedar floor. Now, partly because of the nature of this poetry, again, it's easy, very easy, and I find myself doing this far too often with Emily Dickinson's poetry, reading something so seemingly silly as this, something so seemingly simple as this, something so maybe minute as this, and saying, yeah, okay, that was cute. Okay, all right, I got you. I think it's possible to read this poem and interpret it as basically a simple sort of quizzical rhyme. Possible, but not fair. Instead of that, oh, it's just a cutesy little piece of clever, quirky writing. What if we imagine this as a cry for help? What if this were Emily Dickinson in a diary to herself, essentially, crying out for help? Let's read it again. You cannot put a fire out. A thing that can ignite can go itself without a fan upon the slowest night. You cannot fold a flood and put it in a drawer because the winds would find it out and tell your cedar floor. What else would this poem be if it were not speaking to one's self about the problems one has? Like, I think that it's easy to look at Emily Dickinson's poetry sometime because she's not talking like Bukowski about the person, the other homeless people with whom he lives. She's not Sylvia Plath speaking about almost at times painfully, obviously Ted Hughes. She's speaking about putting a fire out, folding a flood. You know what? What? But this isn't external. She's not talking about a real fire. She's not talking about a real flood. If, in fact, we are looking at this poem starting with that observation, that a writer's not talking about a real fire or flood, this is metaphorical. What else could this be metaphorical? For what else could this be metaphorical? Even worse, our speaker is conceding that so if we are going with that interpretation that this is metaphorical and probably for emotional troubles, right? As this is metaphorical in that way, our speaker is conceding that she cannot control these things. All of us probably have an emotion with which we struggle. For me, it is anger and I won't say depression, but sort of seclusion. If I get angry, leave me alone. If I am alone, leave me alone, right? To the extent that I can control emotions, those two seem off limits. I start getting angry, I can stop getting angrier. I can do that much. But it's hard for me to turn things around. If I am feeling withdrawn, I can be in public, otherwise, how would I maintain a job? But I have trouble being social. Probably you have such emotions as well. Hopefully, it's not all of them. Hopefully, not all of your emotions take you on a train ride. For me, the practice of Stoicism has proven extremely profitable. When I get in those places where those emotions are taking me over, I can practice Stoicism and just kind of not talk about it, right? Our speaker here in this poem is saying, is talking about that very thing. Once those emotions, whichever emotions they are, get to revving up for our speaker, they do not stop. But what emotions are they? Are they sadness? Are they that need for seclusion? Because even worse than not being able to control them, our speaker here seems to suggest that the attempts to control them make things worse. You cannot fold a flood and put it in a drawer because the winds would find it out and tell your cedar floor. There is the old adage, I believe it is a Buddhist idea, that maybe it was the Buddha himself, was meditating in the center of a pond, and it was complete serenity until a frog jumped in the water, and that made ripples in the pond. Well, that interrupted his meditation. So he took his hands to smooth out the water, but smoothing out the water only made more ripples. Basically, the moral of the story is learn to live with the ripples. The frog made little ripples. You tried to fix it and made things worse. That is the idea being presented by our speaker here. And as we get these poems presented in such fashion, it is interesting because just two poems after this, we have this poem. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen, some polar expiation, an omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieverless things, my duplicate to borrow, a haggard comfort springs. From the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought there dwells one other creature of heavenly love, forgot. I plucked at our partition as one would pry the walls between himself and horror's twin within opposing cells. I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury it grew that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me. It seems that we have a speaker here. I mean, this poem is just 2 poems after the poem we are discussing about not being able to control things, and attempting to control things makes them worse. It seems that our speaker is struggling mightily with whatever it is she's struggling. And as we do have these poems seemingly as a diary, these were not readied for publication. We are living through these things in real time with our speaker, assuming that we are reading more than one at a time, which you don't have to do, obviously, to understand this poem. It is necessary only to read this poem. But if we take a little bit more into context, as I often say, Charles Bukowski should be read as a novel, not as poetry. That is, don't sit down and read a Bukowski poem. Sit down with a collection and spend 30 minutes on it, whatever it is that you normally spend reading. And if you do spend that time with Bukowski, you will have a greater understanding of the speaker. And I think that is something that we can apply to Emily Dickinson as well. That is all I have for this poetry discussion. If you like or appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button really does help me, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing that I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos per week. There's poetry every Monday, and I hope to have you back for the next one.